Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Growth and Development Scrutiny Group. For the benefit of people watching on YouTube, I'm Councillor Neil Clark. I'm Chairman of the Scrutiny Group, and then I have various officers in support, and then members of the Scrutiny Group. And we also have two guest speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. If I could just ask you to remember that we are being transmitted on YouTube, so I hope you'll bear that in mind, and also do what I often forget to do, which is to put my mobile phone on silent or whatever. Without further ado, I will first of all go through the sort of the admin things. So item 1, apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Cotty, and we have Councillor Beardsall as a substitute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any declarations of interest, either pecuniary or non-pecuniary? Take silence as being no. And item 3 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of July. Can I sign those as a true and correct record, please? Everybody in favour? Good. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So, on to item 4, which is the main item of interest this evening. And I'm very pleased to welcome two guests who have kindly agreed to come along and contribute to our debate, both very much involved in the subject. The nearest to me in the short sleeve shirt is Richard Cooper from the Environment Agency, and next to him, Chris Bramley from Severn Trent. So thank you for coming along, gentlemen. You are very welcome, and I look forward to us being able to get more information from you and then more understanding as to what it is you do to help us with our various developments around the borough. Is there anything you want to say in introduction?
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered it. Do you want me to share the Richard's presentation first from the Environment Agency?
So in that case, we'll straight in then, and I'll invite Richard Cooper. Perhaps you Sustainable Places team leader. I was just about to say, could you just tell us what your role is in the Environment Agency? And over to you. And as I said earlier, it'll be nice to have a short presentation, and then we can get involved in some discussion. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Richard Cooper. I look after the Sustainable Places team in the East Midlands for the Environment Agency. So that's my team works with the public face boundary. So Catherine, if you want to skip to slide 3, just a little bit as a background, that's the whole area that my team covers. So that's the 3 counties, Derbyshire, Notts and Leicestershire. I'm sure you don't need to realise that that's Rushcliffe in the middle, but I thought I'd highlight it anyway. We look after all strategic planning and all development planning for those 3 counties and all the local authorities that are in there, plus the whole of the Peak District National Park, most of which falls in our area, that top left-hand corner. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about planning and a little bit about wastewater. I'll apologise now if I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but I'm working on the basis that you might not know how the whole system works. So we'll just run through like that. So if we go to slide 4, so I'm going to start with a bit of planning. So half of my team looks at the strategic element. I have one person covering each county, and we get involved with, more often than not, flood risk, contaminated land, but water efficiency, water quality, biodiversity net gain is creeping in more and more, which is brilliant. But these are all the types of documents that we can feed into, and you can probably pick out some of the ones where sewerage and sewage or certainly water fit into those, as well as the main local plan documents themselves. So next slide. This is just an idea of what we might say, and we try and work with the water companies as often as we can, but we've obviously got what we've got to say, what we've got to say, and that's an idea of the sorts of things that we would generally say or suggest, at least for the document. So I'm not going to read word for word what's there, because I think it's more useful to have the conversation at the end as we've found out. So I just pulled that off the gov.uk. Oh, sorry, next slide. This gives you just an indication. I'll just give you a minute or so just to read that to see what it's got to say, and it'll make more sense when I talk in the next slide around more developmental planning side of things. But it's just a message for developers of what to expect, particularly if they don't want to connect to the sewer for various different reasons. It does happen, but usually they usually do connect to the sewerage system. So next slide, please. From a developmental planning point of view, we're quite high level in the terms of we only look at major development for schemes that aren't connecting to mains drainage, because the assumption is that if it is connected to main sewerage, it's not a problem. We'll address that a little bit later, but that's the rules that my team's got to play with, and that's the same across the country. What we don't see is any development that does connect to the mains, and we don't comment on those. Sometimes we're asked to provide comments and we don't, because it's stepping outside of our remit. And anything that we do say, I'm sure you all know, we put down, we have to be able to back up in front of an inspector potentially. So as frustrating as it might be sometimes, that's why we tend to stick to remit. So next slide, please. I just thought I'd put that up there as the surface water drainage hierarchy, in terms of we tend to make this clear. If we get a pre-app, we're getting intimations that it isn't necessarily going to go to mains. So this is how we like surface water to be dealt with. Surface water in the main is a lead local flood authority issue, but at a strategic level, we have comments that we would make to any consultations, but we're hands high at developmental planning. If we're aiming towards the bottom of that, we would say something and point the development control team to the Severn Trent in this instance, or the lead local flood authority, just to say we think you need to have a look at this one. So next slide, please. So the rest of the presentation really is focused on wastewater, and I'm really apologising if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but I just thought it's worthwhile just realising what the system does. So apologies if it's a bit key stage 2 school aimed, but we've got wastewater, and I've focused on domestic really because I think that's really what we're focused on here, in terms of wastewater moves away from our homes. It usually gets flows by gravity or pumped using sewage pumping stations and ends up at a local sewage works. It's then treated to the required standard within the permit and put back into a nearby watercourse. Next slide, please. Older systems, as we're probably all aware, that's why we're having the discussion. Foul and surface water are usually in the same system. That's called combined. Newer systems, particularly on newer developments, have separate pipes for foul and surface water. It's worth remembering that the whole of the system, from a new development right to where it ends up in the river having been treated, even if it starts off being separate, it might not end up being like that. So there's probably questions there as to why, and that might be something you want to come back on. It's just a factor of the whole system as it is. Next slide, please. So what happens when it rains? So wastewater treatment works can usually have storm tanks, and the one in Ratcliffe does. They provide storage for when what's coming in is more than what can be treated. And the idea is that those storm tanks take that overflow, and it can either be treated at a later date, or it can spill. And I sort of liken it to, if you've got a full bath with the tap still running quick and then it's emptying, where's that water going to go? It's got to go somewhere. And we've obviously got pumping stations that help along the way for those flatter parts of the catchment. And if these fail or break down, then these can spill as well. And we've obviously got combined sewer overflows, which again spill during wet weather. These systems, the whole spilling is designed to take pressure off the system. It's sort of the least worst option, I guess, in terms of it either spills into the river or it backs up, and it can back up so far into people's homes. So it's not what would we rather have, but what's the least worst option out of that. And spills are required to be monitored, required by the government. So that's the event duration monitoring that I think some of you have looked at and referenced in the original ask that came to us. Next slide, please. So what enters the watercourse? It's untreated, partially screened effluent. So they used to be called discharge consents to called discharge permits now under the new regulations. So they've all got varying different asks depending on what the receiving water body is and the size of it. So there is some screening there, but not in the way that it would do if it was being treated normally. If it's been held in a storm tank overflow, then there's some settlement, but it isn't like what you might think. It's going into the river under a system where there's been lots of rainfall. So the idea is it's diluted. So trying to liken it to, if you've got a bottle of squash, it isn't the same as just pouring that in. It's diluted down. But obviously, it's not treated to what it would be ordinarily. And this is controlled via, like I mentioned, a discharge permit. So next slide, please. And it's down to the EA to administer those permits and regulate them. And they've got various different water quality parameters on there, which I won't go through, but there are a lot on there. So next slide, please. So in terms of permit compliance, there isn't a limit on how often storm overflows can operate, but they have a threshold as to when they're supposed to operate. So if it's a dry year, they shouldn't spill as often. If it's a wet year, then they can spill more frequently. If we have information that suggests an overflow was operating when it shouldn't, i.e. if it was doing it today or previous days when it's not rained, then that suggests something's not working properly. That would be non-compliant, and we'd look to investigate that. For the first time this year, we're inspecting combined sewer overflows and the sewage pumping stations. Previously, as an organisation, with the resources that we've got, we've focused on the actual water treatment works. The latest slide will show you that, and I'm not blowing smoke up Severn Trent, but they're a good company in terms of how they look after their water treatment works. Our job now is to focus on those areas where the effluent isn't being treated. So can we control CSOs a lot more? Can we control the pumping stations a bit more? And this is being done in a risk-based and ad hoc approach in terms of there's some element of having to organise a visit when you go to a works because you've got to be that on site. Whereas the other sites, the water company doesn't know we're coming. So we see it as it is on that particular point. Next slide, please. So just thinking about Radcliffe, it's gone through. So it's had pretty much a new sewage treatment works built, and this is partly due to the fact that it's now receiving what comes from Cotgrave. Cotgrave used to have its own works, but they were both failing on Water Framework Directive requirements, particularly on phosphate, and it was cheaper and more cost effective to have one really good works than to upgrade two. So now the discharge from the old Radcliffe works used to go to the Polsa Brook, whereas it now goes direct to the River Trent. So there's a lot more capacity for that river because of its size to deal with whatever's put into it. And the rest of the points that I've covered. So next slide, please. Nearly there. Whistletop Store. So the CSOs that spill above the threshold that you can see there would be investigated by Severn Trent in this instance. So the 101, I can't just remember the spills who highlighted that, but yeah, that's probably a high amount. Yes, it was a wet year, but that would require Severn Trent to go and have a look at that. And if it found that not just the works, but the pumping stations that are around it, that are in Radcliffe, would probably require some investigation to see if there was something not quite right happening in that location. What we've got as an organisation is we've got the new Environment Act that was published or enacted last year. And this really gives us a bit more teeth to tackle the combined sewer overflows and those points where there's perhaps less of a control than we would want. And that's aiming to reduce the number of spill events at any one point to a maximum of 10 per year. Now that won't happen overnight, and we certainly haven't got the infrastructure to be able to do that right now. But that's the aim, and that's really good. It's given both the organisation and our Severn Trent, and ourselves the ability to do more than perhaps we can do now in terms of cost benefit, and my organisation in terms of regulating those. So next slide, please. So I've already mentioned that, and the bottom point, which I particularly want to highlight, is it's become a social and acceptable problem, and I think COVID's had something to do with that in terms of making us appreciate the environment that we've got. Thinking back to when we were restricted in terms of what we were doing, and people really came to appreciate their environment. And I've noticed in my organisation, in my area, massive upturn in people's value that they hold for their environment. This is another sign for it. But I guess we've got the opportunity to do something really good in our borough and others in terms of tackling this problem now. So the penultimate slide, the last slide, is we have a new Environment Secretary, and he's been quite vociferous from the off in terms of what his top priorities are, and straight the message that we got was that water security and the quality of that, thinking what we're talking about tonight, is very much top of the agenda. I know he's written to all the heads of the water companies around England and Wales to ask for an action plan as to how it's going to be addressed. And then lastly, Sir James, head of the Environment Agency, has always maintained you get the environment you pay for. And I guess there's a line around, has my organisation got the resources to be able to regulate properly? And we need new infrastructure, and that's not going to come cheap. And how can we address some of that imbalance potentially? So I just thought it was an interesting point to end on, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know, the quote from Sir James Bevan, that sort of almost sounds like a threat, doesn't it?
I guess it's a loaded comment, but it's not loaded for us. But there's a point in there around not trying to politicise it in any stretch at all, but we perhaps haven't got what we used to have, and that makes it difficult to be everywhere, because this isn't just a problem in Rushcliffe or the East Midlands, is what I call it. It's nationwide, and it's probably European wide as well, because this way of treating sewage isn't just an English problem, it's European. And I guess it's time to move on, but it'll take a bit of time.
Right, okay, so let's go straight on to Chris Bramley then, shall we? If you'd like to make your presentation, and then hopefully, I know Richard's presentation has already prompted some questions from me, so I've no doubt that you will prompt some more questions, no doubt.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so my name's Chris Bramley. I'm a strategic catchment planner working in the drainage and wastewater management planning team at Severn Trent. And the scope of what I've been asked to talk about was kind of sewage long-term planning and growth. So we can go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of how we look at and investigate growth needs and how we understand the risks of that, what the information requirements are within Severn Trent, the stages of engagement that we have within kind of various parts of the local plan process, and then I'm going to touch on scheme development as well, because that can be quite a long process, which is we need to explain to kind of understand that. I'm then going to kind of give an overview of what we're actually doing within Rushcliffe in terms of accommodating growth. And then I'm going to move on to give you a very brief overview of our brand new drainage and wastewater management plan, which highlights the need for us to work together and mitigate future risks. So if we can get to the next slide. Okay. So just to, again, putting it in perspective, kind of the Severn Trent region, as you can see, is quite significant. And Rushcliffe, over there on the eastern side of it, we've got 957 wastewater treatment works in the whole of Severn Trent. And a lot of the stats that you'll see through this presentation are kind of more Severn Trent directed. There's 27 works within Rushcliffe itself. So it's a significant portion, but stuff that we need to kind of deal with. Next slide, please. So understanding demand, I think it's key to kind of highlight that developers have a right to connect to the sewerage system. We're unable to refuse a connection as a result of lack of capacity. There is a duty for us to kind of develop a network and provide capacity for planned development. But we need to balance that with kind of against the uncertainty of development that doesn't occur. Which, and in fact, kind of not everything that is kind of proposed to be developed is delivered. And again, we've got to do that without unduly delaying development needs. So the way we look at that is kind of getting a baseline of our risks and understanding. We do that through maintaining a system of hydraulic models that kind of provide us an assessment tool that we can utilise. We engage with the local plan process, both at kind of the development of the early stages, and then we also liaise with planning applications when they come in through our asset protection team, and developer inquiries are dealing directly with developers. We like to do that before the planning application stage comes in. However, that's not always the case, and promoting that need for early engagement with development is something we would actively support. And then finally, once we've kind of got that certainty of development risk to the network and kind of certainty that development will occur, we then look at kind of promoting a project to try and address that and maintain our infrastructure to an appropriate level. So if we move on to the next slide. So looking at that balancing of our risks, whilst we were doing the drainage and wastewater management plan, we looked at kind of trying to predict that long-term growth. And one of the key areas that we identified as a bit of a problem was that looking through some of the reports, the Local Government Association indicated only 58% of planning permissions are actually ever delivered, which is when you're looking at permissions, let alone local plan sites that have still got to go through the permission basis. So how do we gain that certainty that we can actually go and spend money and invest? If we invest in a site that doesn't come forward, we don't then get the funding through the infrastructure charges to deliver that scheme. So there needs to be a balance between kind of when we invest, when we don't invest, and trying to align that with how long it's going to take for us to deliver that project of making capacity upgrades. So getting that understanding of, if it's a larger site, complicated site, we're going to need more time to develop that solution and develop it. Are we going to need to upgrade our models in any area to account for any recent changes, or get some really kind of site specific information to accommodate that, and making sure that everything kind of works out, but that we're still delivering that growth. So if we move to the next slide. So they're quite text heavy, mainly so that hopefully they make sense after the presentation as well. So I'm not reading them word for word. So once we've got that certainty and that confidence that there is a risk there that we need to manage of development having an impact on our system, and we've got the certainty that development will come forward, it goes into what's referred to as a 5-gate process. The first gate is just sense checking that risk and everything to make sure that we actually have something that we can promote and that will stand up once we've got through that. Once we've got a promoted project, it goes into feasibility, and this is where we get a little bit more information, do some kind of concept designs, trying to make sure that we're going in the right direction with the solution, something that could be cost beneficial, and that we're going to deliver something that will resolve the issues that the new development causes. And then once we've got through that phase and that's been signed off by our board, we go into the detailed design where we really dig down into the detail and make sure that we've got all our T's crossed and I's dotted, that design will deliver what we want it to. Gate 4 is kind of the solution actual delivery where we're building on site. And then stage 5 is a review to make sure that we've delivered all our objectives that we set out to with that scheme, and that we take on any learning as a result of that project out the back end of it. And these key stages will be make a little bit more sense as we go to the next slide. So looking at the kind of local plan sites, so the information we were provided through discussions with Rushcliffe Borough Council at various points, I can see that there's quite a few large development sites. Starting kind of on the top left, we've got Gamston Park Village, where we've been working with both Rushcliffe Borough Council and the developer to understand kind of the needs there, looking at developing a solution that will enable us to take flows direct to Ratcliffe-on-Trent, having a reduced impact on the surrounding networks. There is a scheme already in the delivery stage at Melton Road at Walton to accommodate the growth that's occurring there. We've got a scheme at the feasibility stage, but it's coming towards the end of the feasibility stage and about to go in, hopefully going into the design stage soon, to cover the large development at Fair and Pastures to the southeast of Clifton. And that scheme also incorporates some of the growth at Ruddington, because that's on a kind of a connected part of the network, and it was identified that we could combine those schemes. Eastleek, not our finest hour. However, as we started to look at that and conversations with Catherine in Rushcliffe and the Eastleek Growth Board, it was identified that although there wasn't a lot planned for Eastleek, a lot of windfall kind of permitted growth around there as well was having a significant impact. And we were assessing individual sites that presented that there wasn't a risk. However, when you looked at it all cumulatively, there was an underlying risk there that we needed to address. And as a result of those conversations and listening to the Eastleek Growth Board, a scheme was promoted, and that's recently moved into the design phase, which it's taken slightly longer than intended. Unfortunately, some of the flow surveys hit when we had the very big storms, which gave us some slightly erroneous readings as part of that data gathering stage, meaning we needed to do some additional work. Bingham, again, another large allocation, and we're currently hopefully coming towards the end of the feasibility stage on that. It was hoped that would be in the design stage by now, but a few issues have caused that to be delayed slightly. And Cotgrave, we're looking at redeveloping part of our model there to account for a little bit of inaccuracy in that before we take that through to a detailed design. We have assessed a number of other sites, including sites at Gotham, where the development didn't indicate there was significant risk. However, we are continuing to investigate infiltration issues in that area, looking at surface water, which seems to be getting into our system at a high amount. And similarly at Sutton Bonington, the growth site there wasn't indicated to have a significant impact, but we're not convinced that the model is representing it 100% correctly. So we're investigating that to try and make sure that we get the right message and the right information to follow that forward. So as you can see, there is quite a bit of kind of the planned growth that we were told about that we are delivering solutions for, albeit some of them at relatively early stages. So if we move on to the next slide. So drainage and wastewater management plans. We'll jump straight to the next slide, I think, as well. These are very new. We're currently just published our first draft DWMP, and this is a result of kind of the framework that was published by Water UK in 2018, trying to get greater consistency and transparency of long-term planning in the wastewater industry. So it's not that we weren't doing long-term planning, it's just that we did it and then we kind of didn't really publicise what we were doing, so no one really understood how we were doing it and what we were doing. And it was done differently across the water industry depending on kind of the water company that was doing it. And one of the other key drivers from that framework is to deliver this sustainable approach, making sure that we deliver multiple benefits beyond just wastewater treatment, and also trying to develop co-created solutions with partners. And one of the key drivers that with messages we're keen to push is that if you're looking at a problem and trying to find what our answer is to it, you won't find it in our DWMP, because it's not a short-term scheme level solution document. It's that direction of travel, looking at how we mitigate future pressures. We move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, on the other side, aims of the DDUMP are kind of building that transparency and consistency across the water industry, making sure we're driving our investment decisions and development to account for future risks, not just the here and now as well. So we're pushing towards that 2050 timeframe, and also making sure that we give opportunities to collaborate with our stakeholders. Key drivers being climate change, population growth and urban creep. Now, if we were to do nothing by 2050, and I will reiterate that is not our plan, we are looking to do something, as you'll see on the next slide. We'd expect 61% more floodwater to escape, 49% more properties to be at risk of flooding in 1 in 50-year storm, and 40% increase in storm overflow spills, and an impact of 38% of our wastewater treatment works not operating effectively, which is quite significant just as a result of the kind of urban creep, population and climate change impacts, not accounting for deterioration of assets and things like that. So if we move on to the next slide. So what we're planning to try and do by 2030 is look at improving water quality. So some of that is going to be making sure that our overflows are not spilling more than an average of 10 per year in high priority areas and 20 elsewhere, making sure that our operations aren't the cause of rivers not achieving good status. There are a number of other drivers that might cause watercourses not to achieve good status, but trying to make sure that sewerage isn't one of those. Looking at improving our flood resilience within our networks by doing a lot of surface water upgrades, trying to make sure we separate where we can. Again, working around the sustainable approach, trying to get away from concrete tanks and move towards nature-based solutions and greener subsea type solutions, and then looking to improve our wastewater treatment works. If we move on to the next slide. So getting it that longer term view, we're looking to kind of deliver 100% of the DEFRA identified priority areas by 2045 in terms of making sure we're not causing any harm from our sewer overflows. And then by 2050, making sure no storm overflows operate more than 10 times per year or cause harm, and zero serious pollutions and reducing that flood risk in 1 in 50-year storms. So hopefully all the sort of stuff that you're hoping to see from us, and we'll be delivering that over the next 25 years. So if we move to the next slide. Yeah, so looking at the DDUMP structure, I'm not going to dig into this too much, but it's providing a number of different formats to make it easier to read. So we've got level 1 company-wide, and then the strategic planning areas. For Rushcliffe, the 2 strategic planning areas that will be of interest are the Lower Trent and the Soar, which your catchments fall into, and then we've got the kind of the 957 tactical planning units, which are our wastewater treatment works, which is the kind of little bit more detailed granularity. And if you do want to find them, I've provided the link in there, so hopefully you can click on that and find it, because it's not the easiest to navigate to on our website at the moment. If we move to the next slide. And I mentioned earlier about priority areas. So we're out of the 957, there are 31 priority catchments. And within those 31, Radcliffe-on-Trent has made it into the top 31. So it's an area that we will be looking to make some improvements, particularly in the early years of AMP8 and 9, which are kind of 5-year cycles, making sure that we're trying to deliver some of those storm overflow improvements in the shorter term with that work. And then we move on to the next slide, which should be about our current consultation. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we are out for consultation at the moment on this document. So it is our first attempt at this document, and we've tried to engage quite heavily. I know Rushcliffe have attended some workshops, but equally the documents are available on our website, and you can contact us via email or our online form. But we are getting towards the end of the consultation period, so if you have got any comments you want to make sure that our DDUMP is delivering what you want it to as well, I'd recommend you get those in soon, because the consultation is on 30th of September. And I think the next one should be my last slide. Yep. So summarising that, we've talked about the way Severn Trent engage with stakeholders, try and understand kind of where development's like and when it's like to occur. Highlighted the fact that we need reliable information to enable us to do forward planning, because if growth doesn't occur where we've been told, it makes that deliberation of schemes very difficult. We've identified several schemes that are ongoing to accommodate growth sites that you've told us about. Touched on the new DDUMP document, which is aiming to get us to be more proactive and manage catchments in the longer term, and make that publicly available to understand, and then highlighted that need for us to work together to address the risks of climate change and growth. I guess Now it's just, is there any questions? Thank you for listening.
Lovely, great. Well, thank you both gentlemen very much for those presentations, and it was very interesting. And the thrust of our sort of discussion now really centres around you talked about local plans, and in Rushcliffe, in the last local plan, we had tremendous amounts of development. I noticed you put 12% population increase. In fact, our last local plan represented about a 30% increase in population in that particular plan period. Thankfully, this next local plan is not as great an increase, but that last local plan is still being built out and still being delivered. So the crux of this discussion really revolves around the level of housing which we are having to approve and basically impose on the infrastructure. And I think that one of the questions, I don't know if I'm speaking for other councillors, but as far as I'm concerned, basically we are giving permission for all this housing, and we are told as councillors that at planning application stage, well, what happens to all the sewerage? Oh, you don't need to worry about that. The developers connect into the sewerage, and it's up to the Severn Trent to deal with the sewerage that they're handed, basically. So that's fine in normal times, but then in flood times or heavy rainfall times, we all experience where the systems don't cope. So we end up with the impression that the systems are not sufficient and don't have the capacity that we are told that they should be having. So that's where the problems all start. And of course, the very first assumption is, well, if we hadn't built all these houses, we wouldn't have this problem. So I suppose one of the questions maybe to you would be, from the strategic level, how can we work together in terms of maybe, are there any planning conditions? I don't know whether you see planning approvals and planning applications that are made, but are there any conditions that you would like to see that maybe we don't include in our planning permissions? I'll sort of leave that on the shelf, where you can think about that for a while, because I wanted to also turn to Councillor Barney, because you're a co-sponsor, if you like, of this original question. I don't know whether you have any comments to add to the start of the debate.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I joked to Councillor Way next to me at the beginning of this meeting that really we should all be declaring an interest in this item, because it so acutely affects us all. And I think we take for granted, actually, how incredible our sewage system is in this country. I've spent some time of my life living in countries with less adequate sewage systems than our own, and I massively appreciate, actually, and I take for granted every day, how incredible it is that our sewage and waste gets taken away from us, and that my children don't get horrible waterborne diseases every day. It's not the case for a considerable proportion of the Earth's populace. However, obviously, we are aware of the reports in the media, and we've seen what's been going on nationally, and we've been seeing some of the political football that's kicked back and forth between the two main parties in our country around these issues. And I think that's a shame, actually, because I think that together, we're in this together, and the quality of our sewage systems is something that underlying affects all. We all want to see the best, and we want to see our systems and our infrastructure held to the highest account. So the comments that I'm about to make are not being made from a critical standpoint, but just from wanting to understand further about the regulation and about how we mark our own homework in terms of the quality of the sewage systems that we have in this country. The other comment I wanted to make as well, so I'll come back to that in a second, but in my own experience, my own sewage system in Sutton Bonington, so I'm the ward member for Sutton Bonington, and it was partly from concerns of residents in Sutton Bonington. We've got a fantastic flood warden in Sutton Bonington, which is in part hosted with Rushcliffe Borough Council, a guy called Duncan Collins, and he's taken a very active interest in the flooding that goes on in our community, but also in realising the number of sewage incidents that there are every time a flood occurs, and it is quite alarming. So I was intrigued to see that for Sutton Bonington, you've got that as an assessment only rather than a need to do anything further. At my own house, so I actually live in the house that I grew up in, so it was my parents' house. As a boy, we had a septic tank, and when I was about 6 years old, we were connected to the main drains. And every winter, we've had a flooding incident that sometimes lasting for a month to 2 months at a time. And during that time, raw sewage every year of my life has run into the local ditch and into Kingston Brook, and now ultimately out into the Soar, and eventually winding its way into the sea. I noticed about 7-8 years ago that Severn Trent seemed to take this a lot more seriously and have started to provide annually lorries which sit on Melton Lane outside my house, 2 or 3 trucks in a convoy, and make sure now that that sewage, as soon as it gets reported, is collected and isn't dumped. So there's clearly some kind of strategic change there. But in the village of Eastleigh, because we've also identified, these issues are exacerbated to a far greater degree. And in recent, and I'm drawing to a close, and this goes back to marking our own homework, recently, for years, we've known that as a matter of policy, we allow the system to dump sewage again into Kingston Brook slightly further upstream. Obviously, if we didn't do that, the result would be sewage in the streets, which nobody wants. So I'm certainly not advocating that. But there's questions over the reliability of the data, and this is the A question again, and ultimately a government response. How do we have any confidence in the data that is presented from water companies like Severn Trent and others? And you already identified Severn Trent is by far not the worst offender. But in terms of believing anything that we're told about the number of data reports and data breaches going forward. So there's a number of things there that I've waffled on for far too long. But if you could answer any of that, or pick up any of that for me, so about Sutton Bonington, about Eastleigh, and also just about our ability as humble local councillors to believe any of the data we're told from the water companies and also the Environment Agency. Thank you.
And if I just add to that, my ward actually is, would you believe, Ratcliffe-on-Trent. So all the comments you were making about Ratcliffe-on-Trent, and they're similar sort of comments Councillor Barnes just made, because it was interesting to hear about your explanation that you closed Cockgrave, and Cockgrave now metaphorically flows into Radcliffe-on-Trent. How is it then are you able to cope with that sort of basically doubling of the capacity to ensure it does actually all get treated and discharged properly? Because there are many occasions, as has already been exampled, in Ratcliffe-on-Trent, raw sewage in times of heavy rain comes up into even the main street and all down Bingham Road, and causes obviously quite a significant amount of distress. So I'm sure most of us have got anecdotes that relate to that time of rainfall and time of flood, which causes problems. Over to you for any responses to anything that's been said so far.
Okay, I'll put that work in. Yeah, so in relation to Sutton Bonington, as I mentioned, we were continuing to investigate because we're not 100% happy that the model is representing the risk accurately. So what we're trying to do is improve our understanding in that area at the moment. There's been some works done by ops around the pumping station to try and improve an asset that was blocked, the emergency overflow at that point. So although at the moment we're unable to promote it because it doesn't score high enough on our risk priorities against the other projects across all of Severn Trent, we're not satisfied with just leaving it there and going, oh, that's it, that's the end of it, push it to one side. We're trying to improve that information to try and represent what you're experiencing within our model to make sure that we can kind of then get the right score and subsequently hopefully get a scheme off the back of that. With Eastleigh, we did pick it up late, given the nature of the kind of development in there, and we fully appreciate that people have been experiencing very severe flooding as a result of kind of some of the additional growth and the backing up of Kingston Brook into Eastleigh itself as well, which has a knock-on impact on our assets as well. But hopefully the scheme that we're looking to put forward will deliver the solution that our customers and your residents will be looking to receive there.
Any particular response in relation to the capacity of the Ratcliffe-on-Trent pumping station? And well, both in terms of Cotgrave and Ratcliffe going into the one system, but how can we cope with, or how can we prevent the backing up and the spilling over in times of heavy rainfall?
I think
I think in terms of making sure that new development can be dealt with in the proper way, it's ensuring that the surface water element doesn't go anywhere near the sewers, essentially, whether they're separate or not. So I'm thinking of the new housing development that got built at Aslockton, and I think Ruddington's the same, where essentially you've got a nice big attenuation area that sits there green most of the time. It would be nice if they were a little bit more less bathtub like, but that's what they're there for, and that's dealing with that water, keeping it from the system, and then it can flow in that way. So that should be quite robustly stated for any development if they can't send it to infiltration. I think we could be a lot more robust with sort of thinking about that drainage hierarchy that I showed, the bottom two options. How much do you want development? So this is my personal opinion, and this is no way having a go at the council, because you're under so much pressure to deliver housing, which I think is probably environment, housing. It's probably like that in terms of priority at the minute, and it needs to even out. We've got a set of rules which doesn't help anybody. So Severn Trent have to accept the new houses, both in terms of supply and taking it away. We've got, slightly digress a little bit, we've got planning inspectors that are questioning tighter water efficiency measures. So on the basis that if you use less, you're going to send out less. But really the problem is surface water. And I don't consider myself to be that old, but I think I am getting that way. It's raining more than it ever has done, and it's dumping it in loads that we just can't deal with. To go back to your point about Radcliffe, essentially Radcliffe Sewage Works is brand new. It's a brand new site to be able to cope with Cotgrave and Radcliffe and the development that's there already. It has to be able to cope with that in a normal situation. It's the problem we keep coming back to, is what do we do about the spills? And with the new plan that Chris outlined is a good start, I think, in terms of prioritising catchments, in terms of their vulnerability to surface water. But it's difficult because you never know where it's going to fall. But somewhere will flood, and it's happening every year. It's been Matlock twice on occasion. That's not Rushcliffe, I know. It's been Worksop and Retford. They seem to come in twos, so I'm hoping that those areas are all right. And I don't mean to be flippant by that, but
Are you not going to suggest Ratcliffe and Cotgrave are the next two?
Can I suggest over the reservoirs? That would be perfect right at this moment in time. But we need to be a lot more robust in our responses. And if we want safe houses in terms of the environment, in terms of how they operate and their impact, then we need to be a lot more robust at planning. And what I personally find frustrating is the rules that I've got to work to. So I've got in one ear cutting red tape, cutting the amount of time it takes to get planning done, and in doing that, my risk bars have been raised. So in terms of what we would used to have seen and what we now see is not protecting the environment in the way that we used to do. So that arcs back to you get the environment that you pay for. That being said, there's a clear commitment that we both outlined towards the end of our presentations that are seriously going to limit flows over the spills that we don't want to see. But it's going to take quite a bit of time. And it's what do we do right now, because we can't wait 25 years. And nor are we suggesting that that's what happens. But I feel there's an element of strengthening policies that are in the local plan that then the development control team can come back to and refer to, and we're more robust. And the support from those organisations that would provide those comments, if that's Notts County Council as the lead local flood authority, because they see what my organisation doesn't, I need to be more robust on those bigger sites, potentially. But I almost feel like I've got one arm up my back because I've got conditions that I have to use. We can't go rogue. We can't suggest this, that, and anything else. And that's really quite frustrating at times. None of it is any help in solving the issue, but at least we know what we're trying to aim for.
Right, that's it. Very interesting. Excuse me. Before I bring Councillor Butler in, because he has the privilege of wearing the hat of being chairman of the planning committee as well, I perhaps also ought to declare an interest because wearing a different hat, I'm also a cabinet member for of the lead flood authority for county council. So it's interesting how all these things interlink. But I think from what you've just been saying, maybe one of the actions that we could look at as a result of this evening is not necessarily to put you on the spot and give an answer now unless you know the answers, but in terms of the rules that you talked about, to invite you as the Environment Agency to let us know what you think should be strengthened or what rules should be changed or whatever. And I have to say in brackets, did you or have you told us that at local plan consultation stage anyway? But if not, is there anything that you would like to see us as the planning authority doing in relation to planning applications? Perhaps whilst you think about that, because I've no doubt Councillor Butler might have related comments, so I'll invite Councillor Butler to make comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, talking of hats, we all wear lots of hats, and as it happens, I happen to be a member for Cotgrave as well. So I'm bound to say I was really quite pleased when our centre facility closer moved it to Rackley-on-Trent. But it's very interesting to hear how it's working. Just out of interest, what's happened or is going to happen to the old site in Cotgrave? Is it because I have to admit I've not been down there for a lot because I don't make habits walking around water treatment sites, but is it still in effect there should anything go? There should be a need for it in the future, or is it literally mothballed now and going to be used for something else? But and I'll come back with a couple of others in a moment.
Essentially, at the moment, it's used as a kind of it's housing the pumping station to pump the flows over, and then there's the storage tanks that were there previously as part of the works are there to support the pumping station. Outside of that, in terms of whether any of the other land is proposed for any further use by us or selling off, I'm not aware of any of that. It's outside of kind of my remit to advise. Right?
No, that's good. I'm just genuinely interested from a technical point of view. So should some, dare I say, something overload, say at Ratcliffe down the line, is it designed in such a way that it could come back online on stream, so to speak? But I suspect not. Is the answer to that question? To relieve the pressure, for want of a better description. I suspect not, though. Is okay? Would that be right?
I'm 95% sure that no, it's not.
Okay.
Because both sites would used to discharge to smaller water courses. So I couldn't just tell you the one in Cotgrave, but the one in Ratcliffe was discharged into the Polsa Brook, and because of the Water Framework Directive, there was phosphate and other nutrient problems. So Water Framework Directive, if one thing fails, everything fails. which is why it looks like the water quality has gone down. It hasn't. It's gone the other way. It's just a matter of reporting. But for that to be able to adhere to those requirements, it has to go to where the permit says. So once Cotgrave closed for what it used to be there for, a new permit will have been put in place for the activity that Chris has highlighted. And the new site in Radcliffe, instead of going to the Polesbrook, Brook, it goes direct to the Trent. So there's a lot more dilution in terms of it being able to cope with it.
Okay, that's genuinely helpful and interesting. Now, we've touched on the planning side of things, and you've said the very word before we started discussing it. The thought going through my mind, when it comes to the planning applications, especially for the big sites, are you being robust enough? And I think you've already answered that question. And are you hitting any particular barriers? And I know we're sitting in Rushcliffe Borough Council at the moment, but you can be blunt and honest with us. So are you hitting any particular barriers with developers or planners? So given the pressures, as you've acknowledged, that the council's under for such developments and all the rest of it, do you think there is more really that
I'd have to go away and have a look, and just have a look on this specific issue around what the comments were going back. But obviously, things get approval. One of my measures, well, it's one of the big measures for the organisation as a whole, is, are you listening to our advice? So yes, you are. In short, if I think with my talking about hats, with my flooding hat on, because that's the biggest headache I usually have. I think we've been quite pragmatic in the past in terms of, if we get the impression that a local authority is going to go against our advice, we would then tailor our response to make sure that we got as much as possible out of that development as we can. That's not happened. I'm not saying that because that's what happened with Rushcliffe. I know it's happened with others. I'd have to go away and have a look. I think the biggest win would be at the strategic stage, because I think we've missed the boat at the individual development planning.
So it's the local plan stage.
I think so.
Yeah.
But that being said, and it's easy for me to say, and I'm going to say it like it sounds like you don't do it, and I'm sure you do, but what we agree at the local plan and what gets published needs to be followed through into the planning conditions. Yeah. And like I say, I'd have to go. My knowledge isn't good enough to know, to form an opinion as to whether that happens or not.
Well,
So
no, don't worry about it. I was just don't worry too much about the details. Just wondering in general whether there was a feeling that perhaps there are obstacles being put in your place, in your way, so to speak. But I'm not really worried about you rushing back with
that's fine.
In-depth detail.
I think in general there is a pressure to get comments back, because there is a serious. The outside world has lost its patience. I'm sure you feel that, and we feel that as well. That doesn't come at the price of what we've got to say. It just might be late, I guess. But we do come under a lot of pressure. But we generally get what we ask for. I was going to say something else, but
that's fine. That's fine. And then can I just come on to something again? You've touched on this already, but the flood, the big issues you have, and we've all experienced in the last few years, has been surface water flooding here or there. We never know when it's going to happen, but we're coming up to the season now where it may well start happening again. Again, without wishing to put you on the spot too much, relationships with the local flood authority, the county council. At the end of the day, road floods or whatever floods, public, we need to go somewhere to complain. We go to the county, not to complain. That's the wrong word. To report it, to try and get it resolved. At some point, the county council will be liaising with you, and vice versa. How's that all going, do you think?
From a planning point of view, we don't have too much to do with the lead local flood authority, and that's something that I think certainly could be improved.
Okay, yeah.
Because I don't know what they say, essentially, because they have their remit and we have ours, and they don't generally cross. So if I don't know something, then chances are I don't know what's getting
You
missed.
don't know what you don't know.
No,
Yeah.
exactly.
Understood.
So I think there is something there that could easily be improved. We, from a flood risk point of view, and I'm not party to those meetings because I don't go, there are regular liaison meetings, but I don't know how much planning is discussed in those. And if they were, I would have thought I would have been invited. So that tells me that I don't think planning is discussed at those meetings. And I think when, you know, with flooding, it's quite emotive, quite an emotive topic, and I don't envy the lead local flood authority at all. It's and certainly for the outside world, it must be very frustrating to find out. I don't care who's responsible for this bit. I want to know what's going to happen about it.
Right, yeah.
So it is very frustrating.
We've all been there, we share the pain on that.
Yeah.
Interesting to hear those comments, and I, wearing my other hat, I'll clock those comments and may well take those up in a different forum, wearing my other hat.
I think Richard wants to respond.
Richard, far away.
Yeah, I was just going to highlight that actually we have done work with the LFA in the past, mainly around kind of where we have issues of people trying to play the LFA off against the council in relation to surface water discharges, trying to go, well, the council have said this is the discharge rate, and we're going, well, that's, or vice versa, we've said we can accommodate this because there's that capacity in our sewer, and then they push back towards the LFA saying, well, this is what they can accommodate, so we'll discharge that, rather than going for the greenfield runoff rate. So we've changed our kind of standing advice to highlight that the lead is with the LFA as the responsible statutory consultee for surface water flooding. Our responses kind of highlight that it's what we say subject to approval of the LFA. If they want something different, that's the route that you need to follow as a developer, because they're in charge, just to try and remove some of that infighting involved. They've said 30 litres, you've said 20, we'll go for 30 because that's easier for me to deliver. And we've kind of managed to hopefully put a stop to that. That's not just Nottinghamshire County Council, that's been done across the board, but we've also got quite good working relationships with the LFA in Nottinghamshire as well, delivering a number of schemes through that.
Yes, you have indeed. There's a big one in Mansfield at the moment, isn't it? Massive. Yeah. Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. I'm the ward councillor for Eastleek, so I'm pleased to see that we're at the design stage. I assume that's why I've got all pretty colours painted on the roads and the pavements at the moment. It might be something to do with your looking forward. I find it shocking, although I did know this already, that you aren't allowed to say you can't cope when there's a whole new lot of development. And this has been a big thing in Eastleek because we've had hundreds of houses built over the last few years, plus the DMRC, and we are about to get the NRC, the National Rehabilitation Centre, as well. So in your design, how much additional capacity are you allowed to build in, or do you have to do it as it is now, or is there a little bit of forward thinking? Are you allowed to do that?
At the moment, the way it works is our budgetary process is on no detriment principle. So that's designed to kind of work on the situation the network performs at this level. At the moment, the growth project budget will allow us to retain that system in that working order. With Eastleek, it'll be looking back to before some of that development took place, because it's acknowledged that it was picked up late and that it kind of is part of what we've promoted the project for. But the underlying driver behind that is a no detriment. However, where we get opportunities to work with other budget streams such as flooding or overflows, we take those opportunities to try and improve the situation. That being said, the DWMP is looking to drive us in that more forward thinking to building resilience to climate change in the solutions that we're looking to do. I can't say that will be applied to East Leek, given the stage that it's currently at and the stage that DWMP is still draft. But that's the direction we're looking to go in, is to try and make ourselves more resilient and deliver those potentially bigger schemes that will provide that extra term capacity for the longer term. But essentially it's no detriment. We should be back to kind of the beginning of the AMP period for East Leek, with a little bit of extra allowance for the growth that we know we hadn't initially been aware of. It does also include the NRC in the scope.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sorry, Councillor Price.
I can get that we're looking to improve how we handle surface water in new developments. But what work is there to address existing problems? But do we look to build capacity in line with new developments, or are you looking to develop additional capacity outside of that process?
Yeah, so alongside the growth funding route, which is the one that I've highlighted in the presentation today, because that was kind of the main scope of where I guess I have some of the knowledge and what I spoke to with Dave in what we were going to cover. But we do also have funding streams to look at kind of asset management, improving those. We've got flood alleviation scheme projects as well, so that's looking at a different pot of money that we assign for improving the situation in relation to flooding. We've got funding streams aligned with kind of the SOAF, where we're looking to improve overflows and deliver the improvements there, and making sure that we're discharging the appropriate amount and minimizing that and reducing environmental impacts. And then we've got schemes to align with the WINET programme to deliver the WFD and support those needs as well. So there's a whole number of different schemes to improve the network, whereas growth is designed for a no detriment principle to make sure that that budget is allocated to accommodate growth and not deliver other schemes, but it can be aligned with other project streams to deliver multiple benefits.
Councillor Phillips and then Councillor Stockwood.
Thank you, Jim. Just one question. If we come across a big flood in the road or whatever, how do we know if that's a flood from a combined sewer with the FOW and the water surface drainage? Is there a map that we can actually find out for our wards of where the sewers are combined, so we know that's not as dangerous a situation as maybe another one?
I don't think we've got the sewer maps accessible generally publicly. There is through DigDat, people can access them for the purpose of set targets. I've raised an element of caution just because it's a foul and a surface water are separate. If that then connects into a combined further down, or you've got surface water that's infiltrating into a combined system, there is still a risk of that overtopping, particularly where it is designed to be a foul only system and you get surface water in it. They generally don't have the extra capacity that a combined would have to accommodate rainfall. And there are various ways that surface water gets into our combined, either through misconnections on properties or developments. But also we've had experience where people have lifted manholes to allow floodwater to get away and into the system, which can have a knock-on impact downstream. So I guess I'd raise an element of caution of just because it's not a combined system doesn't mean that there's not an interaction between surface water and the FOW system.
So we'll just treat it all as being combined, really, on the safe side, yeah?
From looking after yourself, yes, that I guess would be my recommendation.
Councillor Stockwood.
So I remember the sleep planning applications many years ago, and people were saying then that the problems already existed. And so we're coming back to this issue that you talked about how you might address new developments in the future with more stricter controls. But you've also acknowledged, I think, that you were consulted during the local plan development phase and you're consulted on planning applications and statutory consultees at the local flood authority are consulted, and you've not got any records of advice being ignored. So it comes back to pre-existing problems in the system. You say no detriment, but the suggestion was that there were problems in East Leek long before the new developments were proposed. And people were saying, we know that there's a problem now. This new development is going to come along and have a cause, make it worse. And they're told, well, actually, that's, you know, there's not the evidence to support that. So then it comes to what Councillor Phillips has just raised. How does a member of the public demonstrate, either by referencing existing data or going out in the flood conditions and licking what they find on the street, to demonstrate that there is actually an issue in their area and have their issue taken seriously? So you've talked about new developments and how you've got plans to address them as they're coming on, and whether they were told about them at the right time for you to give enough knowledge of what's been going on in East Leek for a number of years now. But you didn't talk about this how many existing problems are there in Rushcliffe and all this other infrastructure development that we need to separate out the combined system elements from the system, and who's going to pay for that, and you know, where are the problem areas within Rushcliffe that you're targeting, because you just talked about the new thing. And then it's about how do public get access to the data about problems, because I can go on Digidat, and I have done, and I paid to buy the maps, because that's how you get them. You have to buy them to find out that, you know, that map, you know, which drains go where in my ward, and add my own pocket. But there's not a publicly accessible system where a member of the public can say, you know, I'm now experiencing a problem. I don't know how many other people experienced a problem in the last few years. I've just moved into this area. I've lived here. My house might have been there for many years, but I've just happened to move into the area for the wonderful build a nuclear fission reactor somewhere nearby, or project or whatever. But where is the publicly available information about the number of problems within the system? How many times stuff goes into these events that are supposedly being counted? You know, where is all this information available to the public, so that the public can participate meaningfully in saying, I can see that actually this is happening more often, or your data model has these problems in it, that they can participate. So I'm asking questions about not just new development, because I think you've actually said that the Section 106 agreements can cover infrastructure costs if necessary. You're also being consulted on whether or not your advice is being listened to. But the existing problems in the system that's been going on for many decades and built at East Leek and elsewhere, and you've had to pay for Radcliffe somehow. Somebody paid for Radcliffe, and it wasn't done from the new development. There's these scopes of work. How many of those are happening in Rushcliffe? And then how do the public engage with the data on specific sites to find out for themselves? That's the problem that I can bring to people's attention. Is there a clear way for a member of the public to say, I've had, I've got this water there. I can now look on a website, see how many times that's happened before, and I can easily find who to report it to. Who does Joe Public go to say, I've got a problem and I want to fix it? So how do we engage with the public, telling them what's about the data that's already existing, the level of the problems, you've got a long document. Well, we publish local plans, or, do people read these long documents? Are you making available an easy accessible way to the public? And then there's two aspects there I've talked about. One, existing problems, who's paying for them, what's the progress in Rushcliffe to deal with them? And two, this other aspect around in keeping the public aware of what's happened, what to do if something else happens, and what's being done, so that the public then have that information and feel informed that issues are going to be addressed over a time scale in which we describe as being the next 25 years. So, that's something that could last a little bit longer than councils. So I'll just raise those 2 points. Thanks.
I think there are about 25 points there, actually.
Simply talking around the 2 main points.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying. Gentlemen.
I'll just try and come in terms of the issue over data. There's obviously various bits of it. I say obviously, it isn't obvious. There is information out there on gov.uk in terms of there's the event duration monitoring stuff that's there. There's a whole raft of other information that's on there, but it requires the user to know who looks after what information. And because there's that many different organisations that look after water, it really is quite difficult. So what we tend to find is if somebody's got an issue with flooding and they don't know, essentially, it'll come into the EA, it'll go into the lead local flood authority, it might go to Severn Trent, it could go to the IDB. It's not great. And you've got all those different organisations that may make some information available, and other information is paid for, as you've outlined. And then there's the issue of you could look at something in one place, but as has just been said, it might not be quite the right picture a little bit further downstream. So it's very difficult. I don't know all the information for my own organisation that's on that site. You have to know what something's called to be able to find it. So if it's EA remit, it's called Main River. If it's lead local flood authority, it's called ordinary watercourse. You don't know that, then you've got one hand behind your back straight away. So I guess I'm not answering your question, or maybe I am. But what I am saying is it's damn difficult if you're a member of the public and you don't know. It's really difficult.
Sounds like it's difficult if you're a professional.
That's what you need a reporting dashboard.
Sorry, did you want to quickly?
I just think it highlights that it may not necessarily be the planning system itself that's the problem, but it's about informing the public for what's actually going on. And a lot of the perceived issues that people have, if they were fully informed and had access to understanding the issue, they'd understand what was being done and that there's an action plan to address so many of the things that are problems. And they'd be better informed about the scale of the problem and how that relates to other areas and things. Because I mean, a lot of what's been said today is that during floods, there well may be sewage systems affected, but that's because the system is completely overrun by the flood, and that's expected. And people perhaps need to understand that floods are expected to have problems of the nature of sewage being involved. But I didn't actually. There's the other aspect about all the other things that were existing anyway, not just the new developments, because we can talk about planning changes to planning system for new developments, but there's a lot of problems in the system already, and we would like to hear about an action plan for the existing problems in the system, please. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've got a similar question for that, so we'll make a note of that. Councillor Birdsall and then Councillor Barney.
Right. Thanks. My question is more about from an environmental point of view. Right, Emma. Thank you. Apologies. Yeah, my question is more from an environmental point of view. We've talked about the water going into the sewerage plant and the fact that the treatment plant has to have a permit, and there are certain conditions within that permit. I guess that there are concentrations of chemicals and impurities that shouldn't be released from the treatment plant, because if they were exceeded, I guess that would then pollute the local river or watercourse, and obviously that could have a negative impact on the environment. So my question is, how do you monitor that at Severn Trent, and how independent is that monitoring, and do the Environment Agency have oversight of that? And then, just as to close the loop, how does the public know if there've been any breaches? So three kind of questions really, all rolled into one.
Yeah, so the instance I highlighted around the Water Framework Directive, which is there's so many different parameters within there. There's dozens. The biggest ones that give us the biggest headaches in general are nitrate and phosphates. They're both diffuse and point source. So point source being from a specific location, diffuse being from a wider catchment area. And so Cottgrave and both Cottgrave and Ratcliffe were failing on those. So those were sites that were probably put into the WINEP scheme. Chris, you might have to just remind me what every letter of WINEP means, but essentially it's got such a vast amount of money that's put towards delivering these schemes to remedy where in those instances where the water companies are the contributing factor as to some of those problems. So they're put in, and the monitoring that takes place, so there's usually seasonal monitoring about 3 times a year that happens at set locations on a particular water body. So it might not be it might not be the fact that there's a sewage works, that's where it's going in, so there's a monitoring point. Severn Trent will have their own monitoring points with WFD requirements and urban wastewater treatment requirements. So there is a system online, I'm just racking my brains for what it's called, Catchment Data Explorer, where it has all the environmental parameters and their current status for any particular water body. Yeah, you need to know what your water body is, but you can go in using your location. You can type a location and it'll bring it up. And you can find out what the overall status is, what it's failing for, and what I think in Chris's presentation it alluded to reasons for not achieving good, what they are for your particular water body. So there is monitoring that takes place. There's an overarching river basin management plan we sit in the Humber that encapsulates all of those, and then there's various different plans that sit below that try to improve the environment. That's the best place to go and have a look. I don't know if the public can find out where we sample, or if they understand, if they get to know the results of that. I don't think they do, but what you do see is the overall ecological status and the status for the bit that might be passing or failing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Partly from the Environment Agency point of view, if I understand that, then I think there's 957 treatment stations for Severn Trent
in total, yeah.
An Environment Agency sample those, not everyone. So you might take 10% maybe, or even less.
Yeah, so there's an element of self-regulation with Severn Trent, whereby they do the monitoring or they source it to a third party, and then we're given that information that we check. But that's on quality parameters like ammonia, all those different types of things that you would expect to see in treated effluent.
Yeah, sure. So that's Environment Agency. So if we then go down a level to the actual Severn Trent, what tests are you doing on individual treatment stations, and how are you monitoring the independence of those results?
Chris, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay. Splashing green, I'm confused. Yeah, so I'm not an expert on kind of our treatment processes and how we monitor and perform that, but as part of the treatment process, I'm fairly confident that there is monitoring that goes on inside the works at various points and then at the final effluent to make sure that what we're outputting is compliant with our permit, to make sure that we're meeting what we've agreed to meet with the Environment Agency. And there'll be samples done to kind of refine and tweak processes due to, I don't know, a change in a load due to something within the network from day to day, and making sure that our treatment processes are consistent. Most of them won't need much alteration. So there'll be that element of it. And as far as I'm aware, that information is all internal. I wouldn't have thought we'd share that information with the public at all.
So if I can just ask one more question. So if you have a breach of a condition within one of your treatment plants, what you're saying is you don't report it to the Environment
No, it'd be reported to the Environment Agency.
Right. And then you would take action to investigate why that's happened, make sure it doesn't happen again, and what the overall impact would be on the environment, I guess.
Yeah, so if what we're talking, there's two different aspects to it. One is the linking back to the parameters that are on the permits. That's what the sampling is testing, to make sure that they're meeting the requirements that the permit set out. So it's not just at end of pipe when it goes back into the river, it's throughout the process. And I guess part of that is to make sure that the process is working, as well as to satisfy that's more to satisfy the urban wastewater treatment. And then we do get to find that information out. I guess the second point is, if there's a pollution where part of that system has failed for no good reason other than it happens from time to time, then we're told about that. We then go out and investigate. In that instance, we would sample upstream at the source and downstream, so that we can check that yes, it's okay at the upstream point. Here's where it's coming in, and this is the effect downstream. Sometimes finding those three spots it's easy with water company assets because we know where they are. In a general pollution incident, it can be a bit more tricky. Yeah, you've got to go out. So in that instance, we then have fisheries people that go out when there's an incident like that, and they assess, because that's usually the manifestation of pollution. And you're talking about the quantity and diversity of whatever's perished because of that incident. Usually they're short-term effects, unless it's something that's been happening ongoing at a low level. You have to do a bit more investigation then. But in the main, pollution incidents happen. They're quite short-lived. We're quite lucky in that we have a fish rearing place at Calverton, which serves the whole country. They go and stock places that have experienced pollution with species that were lost, essentially. It's a really interesting place. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those answers.
Wow, you suddenly learn things that you never realised that. That's yes, but very interesting.
Yeah, in all seriousness, I can try and make that happen. The only caveat I would say is it's more interesting at different times of the year. So I'll try and find out when that period of time is, and then we can sort it out.
Oh, that'll be very interesting. Great. Well, look, we need to start drawing this conversation to a close. But I think that there are sort of three actions that come from this. Perhaps I'll just quickly ask Chris, though, how you can't quantify it in percentages or whatever, but just approximately or in general terms, have there been considerable additions to the system that reflect the additional housing, or is it as we're told? Oh, well, the system will just have to cope. So are new systems built by Severn Trent?
We do to varying levels. Obviously, not everywhere it's appropriate to do the level of what we did in Newark recently with the large tunnel, and it's usually kind of piecemeal where we've got problems and we've got the funding stream that can support that, and we do the upgrades to resolve existing problems through, as I mentioned before, the flooding stream or the pollution stream. So there are network improvements that are made to accommodate either a deficiency or to accommodate growth, and that is occurring.
And do you actually have, do you make requests for contributions if you're consulted by the planning authority? Because I believe, or I'm given to understand, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, that the planning authority doesn't always receive responses from Severn Trent on planning applications, but do you ever make requests for contributions? I'm thinking of particularly large applications, obviously, which involve large numbers of houses.
No, on the basis that we have the infrastructure charge, which is a fixed levy per property, which we agree with Ofwat to accommodate that. So we charge the developer for kind of the developments, the houses that they're connecting. It would be inappropriate for us to then make a further request for additional charges, is how I understand it.
Right, I'll cross that one off. Right, yeah, lovely. Sorry, Councillor Price, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on that, you mentioned that when it comes to new developments, you have a principle of no detriment. Is there any opportunities to kind of move one up from no detriment to this is an active opportunity for improvement?
And again, this is where I mentioned earlier that we have to kind of get that funding from another stream. So the main driver behind a project might be a growth scheme, which will be looking to do a no detriment solution. But alongside that, we're aware of an existing flooding problem, and we'll be looking to kind of secure funding from that stream to try and improve the issue that we've got there, which again is what I believe is happening in this week, but I haven't got the specifications to confirm that with certainty. But yeah, so we don't look at it and go, right, there's growth here, we're delivering a growth project, we're only going to deliver a growth project. It's a case of the primary driver is a growth project. Can we secure enough funding to deliver more than the no detriment from another work stream, in which case they will be looking to align those work streams to deliver a more resilient solution. But it is all back on the cost benefit analysis, making sure that we spend the right money in the right locations.
Right. I think maybe coming out of this discussion, and I'm open to other suggestions, but maybe a couple of things. Firstly, probably the best way would be to write to both organisations to ask if you think there are conditions or requirements that we are either missing or not including in conditions of planning applications that would assist in trying to prevent issues and problems occurring. And secondly, I think probably aimed mainly at Severn Trent, probably to request if you have an action plan for dealing with pre-existing or preventative measures to deal with problems that are occurring from existing dwellings as opposed to the new dwellings. Does that sort of reflect the discussion, you think? Are there any other Councillor Butler, you're looking very pensive.
No, I think it covers well. I mean, that's the main point. Are we asking for enough? Basically.
Yeah, Councillor Price.
Just to pick up on one of Councillor Stockwood's points from earlier,
was it number 17 or was it number 21? Which one was it?
But the point about how do people find out, about what's going on and how do you perhaps enhance the
Okay.
data that you're collecting. So I've just been googling whilst we've been talking and found the kind of check my area service, which looks to be very much focused on live incidents of leaks and that sort of thing. Is there an opportunity to use that type of service for things that aren't like acute one-off incidents, so that you can see, well, what is the level of recurrent problem in my area?
And we have to be careful in what we publish due to kind of property blight risk and things like that. So publishing problems is something that we have to be very careful about. So it's not widely available to the public. You can report flooding through that system as well, I believe. But the only way really to kind of raise the priorities to keep reporting issues, so that we kind of get that evidence base and that reference that supports the scheme when we're trying to promote it through one of the work streams, such as flooding, or restricted toilet use, which again kind of falls under that capacity element, or our pollution side. It's just kind of re-reporting those issues as they reoccur, and that pushes it up through the priority system. And there's various work streams that look at managing that across all of Severn Trent, so that the biggest risks are the ones that are dealt with and promoted through our relevant budget stream.
So maybe the third thing could be is for us to establish what information is publicly available on the systems. I accept what you're saying about some of it can cause blight and be difficult, but I think we need to establish exactly what information is publicly available. Yeah, okay. Right. I was just going to ask you, any closing comments? So far away.
I was just going to come in just to say that I'd like one of my members of the team just to come and work with Rushcliffe on an ongoing basis. The person I'm thinking of doesn't live too far from here. Not exactly where, but just to discuss some of those things we were talking about. And out of all the local authorities that we administer, Rushcliffe is one of the ones we receive the most applications from. So from that aspect and a strategic point, I think it'd just be useful. While we've got this forum, it's a good starting point just to make sure that those conversations are ongoing.
Great. And perhaps if when we've got sort of clarification or answers to these queries, maybe you may be amenable to coming back to a future meeting just to sort of clarify or progress, and so that we can hopefully have a better system. And just by virtue of working better with each other, working together, so that exchanging more information and better information, hopefully we can try and lessen the impact of these. If they're extremely extreme, then okay, that's difficult, but perhaps we can try and prevent some more of these, what I'll call maybe medium events rather than the really extreme ones. Okay, right. Is everybody in agreement with those three actions? Is that okay? Brilliant, lovely. Okay, so it just forced me to thank you both, gentlemen, very much indeed for giving up the time to come and talk to us. Much appreciated. And please, we certainly as a council, it's always good to talk, and it's always good to liaise with each other. So, and I think there's a good suggestion to for one of your staff to have a discussion with the planning officers. Yeah, very good. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed, and safe journey home, and I hope you don't go through too many floods. Thank you very much. Right. So I realise time is pressing, but I think that was a very interesting and informative item. So we'll move straight on. Thank you. Good night. We'll move straight on to item 5 and the COVID-19 business recovery update. Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. So Caroline and I are going to do a double act this evening on this, and we'll keep it as short as possible because I am conscious of time. So this is basically a presentation that just gives a little bit more detail behind the report that you've obviously all had sight of. So starting off with a little bit of data. So the information that I'm presenting here is all available on the D2N2 Local Enterprise Partnership website. So they've got various economic dashboards. So if anybody is particularly interested, you can have a look at how Rushcliffe is performing and also other areas across Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. But as you'll see up there, unemployment claims have maintained a steady decline since significant surges in March and April 2020, which obviously as expected after COVID. So unemployment claims are at 1,410 in Rushcliffe. So that's a 38.4% reduction on the same period last year. So this is measuring data from March this year. That's the latest information they've got. So 1,410 March this year. I did go back and have a look pre-pandemic. So in March 2018 it was 665. So we are still up from pre-pandemic levels, but hopefully it will maintain its downward trend. There are currently 403 job vacancies in Rushcliffe, and the LEP have done some analysis of the labour market demand in Rushcliffe. So this shows there are 800 unique job posted between January and July 2022, predominantly in sales, IT and telecommunications professionals and functional manager director positions. The one on the far right of the screen is business closures. That's only available at a Nottinghamshire county level, not districts, and you can see some fluctuations in the trend there, and that's because there were periods of suspension of company strike-offs during the pandemic. So companies have suspended that for a period of time. So you can see some peaks then when that was released again, and obviously then there would have been a backlog of data reporting through Companies House, so that explains that. So that's kind of one to monitor in the longer term. But there were 666 business closures in March 2022, but as I said, that's across Nottinghamshire rather than being specifically for Rushcliffe. During the pandemic, the economic growth team, and we have continued to do this since, we've monitored vacancy rates in our main town and village centres. So this was a requirement of the Welcome Back funding that you recall we had, that we monitored vacancies in our town centres. At the moment, the majority of our town centres have few or no empty units, with a few exceptions in West Bridgford, Bingham and Radcliffe-on-Trent, and that's markedly different to areas like Nottingham City and other areas in the north of the county that are struggling more with vacant units. There's also quite a number of office units that are to let, particularly in West Bridgford, around Gordon Road and Tudor Square areas of West Bridgford, so kind of the ones that are above retail units, so not kind of directly affecting the high street and the appearance of the high street, but still. We also, for the obviously we've got our own commercial property portfolio, so August occupation levels in our industrial units were at 100% occupancy. In our offices we've got 2 vacant units at the point, which are being marketed, and then we'll shortly we have Bingham Enterprise Centre opening up next to the new office development. So there's 12 small offices being built there at the moment, and we've got 4 interested parties who've agreed heads of terms for those offices. So there's already quite good interest in those. And I will hand over to Caroline to give us an update on the work that we've done during COVID.
Sorry to have kept you so long, Caroline.
That's fine. That's not a problem. Yeah, so after over the last year, we've been busy, obviously, coming out of COVID. We're fortunate enough to have the Reopening High Street Safely Fund, which then was extended to the Welcome Back funding.
a lot of the work that we delivered and that we said we were going to deliver when we came to Scrutiny last October was around the high street support and spending the funding that would been allocated, along with supporting our 6 sort of larger towns and villages in spending their allocation too. Some of you may know Ophelia Gamble, who is bottom left. We employed her services as a town centre consultant. She worked in West Bridgeford and the other main town centres, both with spending the funding and working with retailers, giving them help, advice, and trying to set up retail forums. Some were more successful than others. Bingham and West Bridgeford probably had the most engagement and have continued since. Some of the funding was focused around events. We put on quite a lot of events throughout the borough over that time. That was one of the easy ways of meeting the criteria of the funding and increasing footfall to the high street. We did a lot of campaigns. I mean, a lot of this is detailed in the report. The other success, in my view, is we were fortunate in employing Charlotte in February this year. So that's given us the sort of continuation in the good work that Ophelia had done and in the relationships that we'd started to build up with the high street businesses. So she's sort of taken over the mantle. We always used to have an intern in that post, but it's changed, and now we've got Charlotte on a 2-year fixed contract. So she's building on the work that we did using the Welcome Back funding. Another area of focus, which Charlotte has progressed as well, is the refresh of the Rushcliffe Business Partnership. So we've started to sort of refresh the steering group, come up with some new ideas, put on some new events, and she's been leading on that. The networking events the numbers are increasing. There does seem to be quite a lot more involvement, and she's doing a fantastic job on social media, both with the West Bridgeford Way and the Rushcliffe Business Partnership social media following. We've continued to work with our external agencies, the D22 Growth Hub, for signpost posting, because obviously we're a small team. So a lot of the business support is delivered by the Growth Hub, which we signpost to. Apparently, between 2020 and 2021, they supported 424 businesses in Rushcliffe. That's including one-to-one business advice, webinars on topics such as financial resilience and all sorts. So yes, it's been a busy year. Moving on to the continuity. Some of you may have seen this presentation. I'll just give a quick overview about the UK Shared Prosperity Funding. This is replacing the European Structural Investment Fund, which has ending basically over the next couple of years. Rather than whereas the European Structural Investment Fund we had to bid into, this is an actual allocation for Rushcliffe over the next 3 years. It was based on a formula based on need and some sort of government formula. Yeah, so we've been awarded about just over £2,500 over the next 3 years. And 2.5 million. Oh, sorry, 2.5 million. It's late. Yeah, so that's the breakdown over the next few years. There's 3 investment priorities. One's communities and place, one is business support, and one is people and skills. The people and skills funding doesn't kick in until 2024-25, because that's when most of the projects that are run by currently supported by European funding will end. Myself and Catherine, with involvement from stakeholders and colleagues, we finally submitted our investment plan on the 1st of August, which sort of details our main priorities and identifies how that fits with our strategic plan going forward. We've also been doing quite a lot of work with our colleagues across the districts in Nottinghamshire to see if there's any joined-up projects that we can do. Some of those will be around business support, and some of them will be around people and skills. Because although the focus of this fund is to make sort of local areas more responsible for what their focus is in that area, for some projects it makes sense on economies and scale to work with our colleagues throughout Nottinghamshire, so it's not too much of a postcode lottery. So the overarching principles for the shared prosperity funding is alignment with the government's levelling up objectives, but also it's had to fit in with our local priorities. So the priorities in our corporate plan, which includes sustainable growth and the environment. It's intended to support communities and businesses across Rushcliffe, so sort of reflecting the needs of our borough, basically. Obviously, because of the constraints of the funding and the amount that we've been allocated in each year, we've had to do quite a lot of work around what's deliverable. In year one, the focus is going to be mainly around communities in place, because obviously we've still got the same arrangements for the business support and the people and skills at the moment. So we've tried to have a look at a few projects that are deliverable in year one, and they're mainly around communities in place themes. All the projects that come through, we've got to demonstrate value for money and encourage match funding where appropriate. And again, the projects that we're looking to take on board, we need to sort of demonstrate that they're needed and that they can add value to the offer that's already out there.
The other thing that was announced a couple of weeks ago is an addition to the UK Shared Prosperity funding for some areas. So there's the Rural Prosperity Funding, I think it's called, Rural England Prosperity Funding. So Rushcliffe has been allocated £596,000, and that's starting from next April. So what we now have to do is essentially an addendum to our investment plan that we've already submitted that sets out how we're going to allocate this additional 596. So this is for areas, obviously for rural areas. So I think across Derbyshire and Nottingham, this is about 7 of the districts that have been allocated chunks of money, and obviously we are one of those. And it's specifically to deal with issues that might affect a rural area that wouldn't necessarily affect other areas. It's solely capital grants. So it might be, we have looked at capital grants as a potential from our UK Shared Prosperity funding pot as well. So there might be capital grants for parish councils, for example, to make improvements to community buildings or play parks or something like that. But this is all about capital grants. SPF is a mix of revenue and capital. So as it says up there, rural is towns and villages and hamlets with populations below £10,000, and market and hub towns with populations of up to £30,000. And the guidance says we need to consult with local rural partners and also encourage to speak to our MP, which was the same for the head of the investment plan being submitted. We had a bit of a stakeholder workshop and we had a conversation with both of the MPs in Rushcliffe as well to get their support for the investment plan that we were submitting. Similarly with the UK SPF funding, the match funding or co-funding, it's not a mandatory requirement, but we're encouraged to look at that where that might be appropriate. So for example, under business support, if we were issuing capital grants, we might request that there's a match funding contribution from a business for that kind of thing. So that's a piece of work. We've got until the 30th of November to submit our addendum to the shared prosperity funding that sets out the how we're going to allocate that. a bit like with the UK Shared Prosperity Funding, that is a kind of high level plan, and government have indicated that we can have some flexibility on that over the next 3 years. So we've kind of done an indicative plan and put allocations of funding against different interventions, but not the detail of specific projects that we're going to fund at this stage. So I think one of the things that I'll add about UK SPF as well is it's an agenda item for January Scrutiny Committee, but because it's taken up mine and Caroline's time over the last few months, quite a significant amount of our time, we thought it would be remiss to leave it off out of this report, and hopefully what we've given you is a kind of taster and an overview of the UK SPF and what it's all about and the rural funding. And then what we intend to bring back in January is a bit more detail about the specific projects that hopefully by then we've already delivered for this financial year, and then a bit more detail about what we're then planning in year 2, so we can have a bit more of a conversation about the detail of what we're doing at that point. So this final slide is the last part of the report, so future areas of focus. So as I've already outlined, UK Shared Prosperity Funding and rural funding will be a key area of focus for the team. And indeed, because, as Caroline mentioned, the themes are around communities in place and things like that, it does the work will impact on different areas of the council as well, involving the communities team and property team and lots of other. So we've set up an internal project group to start to look at sort of that year 1 spend and making sure that we're getting that out, because we've got the £312,000 that we really need to get spent or allocated by the end of March next year. So it's quite a tight window to spend that amount of money. Another one is Rushcliffe Business Partnerships. So Caroline's already mentioned that we have done a bit of a refresh of our steering group that we have. We've got some new members who are really keen to work with us, and they've got lots of ideas about how they want to drive the business partnership forward and what more we can do to engage different businesses. So we're getting more and more people coming to our networking sessions. We've had some events already. We've got one on Monday at the cricket. That's just an informal networking, a paid for event, and then we're planning hopefully a annual showcase event, kind of a conference type thing in January at BGS in Keyworth. We've had them previously and they've always been really successful, attracting sort of 80 to 100 businesses, so we're hoping for that again. Now people are happy to come along to these sorts of things. We've got a gentleman called Insan Faruqi, who is our business support advisor associated with the Chapel Lane development. So we got how much funding? 1.6 million of European Regional Development funding towards the construction of the offices at Chapel Lane in Bingham. And as a condition of that funding, we had to provide business support for the businesses in that building, but the outputs that are also a requirement of the funding means that Insan won't only be offering support to the 12 businesses that will eventually be in those offices. He is available to other businesses in Rushcliffe, so it's something that we've never had before, kind of dedicated business support advisor. He's not full-time, so he's with us kind of 1 or 2 days a week, but it's a new offer for our businesses that we can kind of get out there. So we're doing quite a lot of work to try and promote that, and we're working closely with Insan on that as well. As Caroline's mentioned, it's still a key area of focus for us to support our high streets, and we're looking at the retail forums that we've established through Ophelia's work and continuing with Charlotte, but also supporting existing groups like Eastleigh Traders and the Ruddington Village Partnership and those kind of groups as well, to make sure that we're giving them the support that they need, as well as the individual businesses that approach us. And then, as many of you will know, around the table we've got our growth boards that some of you are involved in areas, and it's a key work for the team that we continue to deliver the kind of actions and activities that come out of those, including long stay car parking in Bingham, the accessibility study in West Bridgford, and areas of work like that. That's it. Can I take a breath?
I was going to say, that's just what I was going to say. You can take a breath now. Well, I think, as you can see, the officers have been extraordinarily busy in supporting our communities and businesses. So that's very impressive. Are there any questions anybody has to raise? Councillor Stockwood, then Councillor Beardsley.
So firstly, I think the agenda item is titled as about COVID, but looking at the figures that were presented, I think it suggested that actually the impact of the pandemic has been addressed. Well, there was a great deal of government support throughout the pandemic for businesses in terms of grants that were distributed, etc., and that the figures show that the overall trend is that there hasn't been that as great an impact in this area from the pandemic. And I think looking at the report, what I felt was that it was mostly about other things than the pandemic. I think there were other things going on in the economy, and I've spoken about them and been told off for ranting at the governance committee. But I think there's a war on, and there's other things going on in the world that are causing economic problems and which drive us forward. So I think in the question that is asked in the recommendation, we're focusing on activity for the future. I think the points that are listed in 4.19, I'd talk about those. I'd say that moving forward, I don't think it is about the COVID pandemic anymore. I think it's about the wider issue of economic growth in the current wider economy. I think we should perhaps moving away from talking about it as a response to COVID and more about as a response to however people want to view what's going on in the wider economy. Looking at the 4.19 comments, you've updated your slide because one of the points I would make are the comment that the 4.19 5 points moving forward are very high street focused, very retail focused, very office focused. I think there's a wider economy which you do touch upon in that second fund that you've recently been contacted about, which is the rural economy. So I think with regards to focus for the future, I think you should be bringing into 4.19 5 points that point you put in the slide about the rural economy, because I think you talked about a diverse economy across Rushcliffe, and I think the rural businesses is something perhaps you need to perhaps widen out when thinking about wider economic growth from high street focus that's been going on into the wider rural economy. And I do think that introduces the question about aspects of the economy that we perhaps haven't spoken about. And I think council as a whole has moved away from startup small units, providing that infrastructure, and whether or not we have can find projects to support the startup economy within Rushcliffe. So starting at the very bottom, I would say the startup economy, then you've got economy of different places where you need to think about the rural economy, not just the high street economy. And then I think when you're looking at the smaller, slightly larger businesses, I think you've got, which I would like to see an active project to promote, a series of industrial land allocations across Rushcliffe. The previous slide talked about mixed sites. They weren't all housing sites, they were also industrial sites. There's places in each development that are being allocated for industrial use, and growth means promoting those sites as places for business. And those places then provide local jobs within rural economies for the hub towns and for the smaller villages to have shorter commutes. So I think promoting those industrial sites would be a focus that I would like to see coming forward in the future. And I think on the larger business, I think within your report, you talked about this carbon group that you've just formed, but you don't carry that forward through in the 4.19 points. So being presented with a report of that, that was written at the time it was written, and you had additional information forward, I understand that. But moving forward, the question at the very bottom is, what should we focus on, and what there's a recommendation, sorry, and I've lost it in
middle of page 19.
Yeah, so there's a recommendation which asks us about what to focus on in the future.
So it's the proposed, I'm going to change it to welcome the proposed future activity and identify additional areas of focus
for the team. So looking at the focus, I believe that the focuses that we've been asked to look at is 4.19. I think they could be widened to rural economy, the industrial sites, the startup economy, and I would like it to think that the focus moves wider than the high street support, which has been very much the focus of the pandemic work. I think we're moving beyond the pandemic description of what's going on, and it is now economic growth as a wider issue. And so I suggest I would like to put those points forward as regards to the 5-point focus as described in the report. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I agree with you in terms of the rural economy. I don't know whether, in fact, I don't know whether Councillor Butler might have a comment about in terms of local plan, developing local plan. We have industrial allocations in various forms. I know Councillor Stockwell made a distinction between mixed development and industrial, but I think as far as I'm aware, I think we almost over-allocated industrial land at one stage. Unless
point of information, I just say that the official opinion of JPAG is that those industrial sites are currently still required. So it's not yet a no.
I know they're still required. Doesn't mean they're going to get used though.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just highlight that the official opinion is that they're still required, and therefore we could positively promote those.
Yeah. I'll just ask Catherine to come in first.
I was just going to say, so I totally agree with all of your points, and probably a lot of what you've talked about will be picked up in the UK Shared Prosperity funding. So underneath those 3 communities in place, business support and people and skills, there are 41 interventions that kind of at a high level, this is what you could support with this, and that includes things like low carbon, and obviously now we've got the dedicated rural fund. So I think that there's quite a broad focus to that, and we can what you've described we can talk about at the meeting in January, and it's really useful to get that feedback, because that can help inform our plans as well. And particularly the startup support is things that we've talked about when we're delivering a business support programme that is more tailored for Rushcliffe. Startup support is one of the areas that we've discussed having support for. In terms of the sort of inward investment bit, again, that's something that we're looking at, but more with colleagues across Nottinghamshire and potentially Derbyshire as well. And that's our sites are included in documents that go to various inward investment organisations like Invest in Nottinghamshire, like Midlands Engine, so they're aware of our bigger sites. So obviously we've got the redevelopment of the Ratcliffe-on-Soar site, that's 270 hectares of employment land that we'll have in the borough, and then at each of our 6 strategic sites that are in our core strategy, there is an allocation of employment land. So Fairham's got 20 hectares, Bingham's got 15, I think. So there's allocations on each of those sites, and so we are working to promote those, but there's absolutely certainly more that we can be doing to be more proactive, working across a sort of wider geography for those.
Yeah. I don't know, Councillor Butler, anything to add at all?
Not a lot to add to that really, but just a query about on the communities in place aspect of the funding. Obviously, the big priority is business growth, but are there are other opportunities here for well, literally for community involvement and projects, call it what you will. Are we fairly happy or sure how we're going to get the message out? Because I do wonder sometimes whether a lot of groups, organisations and businesses, despite our efforts, somehow don't get to know about the opportunities available. So I guess what I'm saying is communications plan.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that we've started that a little bit with the stakeholder workshop that I mentioned, where we involved organisations like Arcan and RCBS. We had a business representation of a large business and a smaller business, but yes, and Councillor Robinson's done presentations at the Town and Parish Forum, so our parish councils should be familiar with it, and I think he's going to cover it again at one in the future. But that should be a key element of our work, is engaging with the various organisations. But whilst also £2.5 million or £3 million when you include the rural funding is a lot of money, but it's quite a small amount of money with the list of interventions that we could possibly support. So it's all, we need to prioritise really what we do want to invest in, because you could effectively almost do anything with it. So what do we want to do with it? How can we target it in the best way and prioritise it? So whilst we do definitely need to communicate and engage with stakeholders, we do need to manage expectations about how much it can actually deliver.
Yeah, so we don't want to, yeah, I see that, I understand now, you don't want to sort of build people's hopes up too much and then with the danger of it not happening, yeah, or running out, yeah.
I mean, I agree with the comments about the rural economy. I thought they were included in one of your earlier slides that related to the shared prosperity funding.
Yeah, they are. So the rural funding, I think, was announced last week. So that's why it's not included in the report. But obviously we've so that was obviously we've added that in because that's an addition. So yeah, absolutely, that will be picked up through that funding. But alongside that, because again, that's it's £500,000. So whilst it will have a big impact, as alongside the UK Shared Prosperity funding, as a team, we can take that feedback on board and think about how we engage with those areas as well.
Can I just add? Sorry, yeah, just going back to the business support and the UK SPF. Again, the interventions, we have identified quite a few interventions that we will support. Just going back to them now, it's all around training hubs, business support offers, incubators, accelerators. We've identified that as a priority, supporting decarbonisation and improving the natural environment. So we have had a look at the priorities and indicated which are relevant to Rushcliffe. A lot of the focus has been in getting the investment plan in, and now we're sort of starting to formulate the plan going forward. So, the spend for year one, but also planning for the business support element in years 2 and 3, and the people and skills in year 3. So that's high on our list of agenda, is to identify initiatives in Rushcliffe in preparation for year 2.
Okay. Councillor Price. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll go Councillor Price and then Councillor Beardsley.
Just picking up on the proposed future activity, the Rushcliffe Business Partnership, obviously you said that you're looking to develop that. Do you have kind of baseline data in terms of how many, what's footfall like and what's your target to increase?
Yes, we do. So we have we sort of record when we have a twice a month we have networking, one in Ruddington, one in West Bridgford at the moment. We have tried it in other areas, but with less success. But again, that's something we could explore again. So we record how many businesses are coming to those. Obviously, we've got the number of businesses that are on our database through the business partnership, and we've got the number of followers on social media and views to our website and things like that. So we've got targets that we set for the business partnership, because we kind of provide support for the business partnership, but it's business owned and run really. So we've got targets for them to kind of increase their reach with businesses in Rushcliffe, and they do that through that kind of data and monitoring of that.
Councillor Mills.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm standing in on this committee, so sort of kind of catch up for me. I'm just trying to understand something. Is this you've got the £2.5 million over, I think there's a 5-year period, split it 3-year period, split into various amounts. Now, is this a case where businesses are applying to you for funding or grants? I'm just trying to understand that, and I have a question on the back of that, depending on what the answer is.
So basically, it's going to be a bit of a mixed approach. So it might be for business support. So at the moment, some of you may be familiar with the Growth Hub that operates, which is hosted by the Local Enterprise Partnership, and that's essentially supposed to be, Caroline referred to it, a one-stop shop for business support. That's funded through European funding at the moment, but that will end in June next year. So the Growth Hub will cease to exist unless the local authorities wish to continue to fund it. So it might be one way that we would allocate funding is we would say draft a specification that says we want business support and we want an organisation to deliver startup business support, financial business support, whatever it might be, a grants pot, and then organisations like East Midlands Chamber might come forward and say, well, we'll deliver that for you. And so it would be through a kind of procurement process, or we have allocated some funding to potential grants so that businesses, any business could come and say, can we have X amount of funding to deliver X innovation project or research and development activity or whatever it might be.
Okay, and so that I'm glad you said that, because that leads the first part of your answer. I understand, and that's a really good way forward. The second part of the answer, one of the key areas I think that is important there is transparency. So if you are offering grant funding to businesses, I think what is important is that the council communicate the types of projects that businesses can apply for, what the rules are in terms of how you would select to get that funding, and so on. I think that's quite important. So that also, in effect, advertises the objective of delivering that funding, rather than, and I know it's an early stage right now and you've probably not gone down that road, rather than just saying, well, you know, if it creates economic growth or carbon neutral, they're all very sort of buzzwords, very valid, obviously. And so then I would also attach to my observation is involve the local community, business community, and other councillors to help design or come up with what that funding might be for, so that we hit our priorities, both from an elected member's point of view that we know in our communities, and obviously from a business development point of view. So we've got all stakeholders involved. So just my observations. Thanks for the answer.
Yeah, so we've got a meeting tomorrow afternoon with the Rushcliffe Business Partnership Steering Group to have a discussion about what business support they might like to see in Rushcliffe, what grants they might like to see. So it's a first meeting, it's an initial conversation just to get some feedback from them, and then we would intend to open that up wider. And the other thing I'd add is absolutely on the kind of eligibility criteria for any grant funding, and government have set out in their specifications a table of outputs and outcomes that they would expect to see delivered against the different interventions. It's quite challenging for Caroline and I to complete, because when you don't know the exact projects you're going to do, how do you know what outputs and outcomes you're going to deliver? But we've put some numbers in there. So then again, if there was a grant pot available, we would make it clear that, you know, you need to hit one or two of these outputs or outcomes, and some of that is about you know, infrastructure that they might have installed, or jobs that they've created and things like that. And then obviously we can add our own onto that, but as a minimum they would need to meet some of those government set ones. It's
Excellent. Right, any other comments? No, in which case we've got the recommendation as shown there. I suggest we delete the word reviews and put endorses, but I'm just wondering what phraseology we could add to so that we're actually ensuring that rural funding is part. I know you put it in that slide, but what wording could we use to ensure that rural funding is included in the future?
I think because it is part of the shared prosperity fund. I think because it is part of the shared prosperity funding, it could probably be incorporated into that point, because it is an addendum to the SPF.
Or maybe we just say a note that support for the rural economy will be included within the shared prosperity funding.
Yeah.
So it gets made.
Yeah, just so that it is noted then. And I'd like to add a second recommendation that we thank officers for the expeditious actions in delivering support for communities and businesses in recovering from COVID. Does that sound fair enough?
Yeah.
It's very expeditious. I think, Mr. Chairman.
Pardon?
Very expeditious. I think.
Very expeditious. Yes, I thought it was as well. Anyway, with those two recommendations, is everybody in favour of those two recommendations? Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for that. I realise it's getting late. We just need to look quickly at agenda item 6, the work programme, which is probably moderately straightforward. You already mentioned the January in terms of the Prosperity Fund. Whether it's appropriate to maybe have a follow-on from our sewerage debate, or, putting that in March possibly with a question mark, just to follow up information so that it's not forgotten. I don't know if there are any other points, but that's where we are at the moment. So the work programme is a bit on the light side at the moment, isn't it? So we need to put our thinking caps on to bring some matrices forward for topics for discussion. Okay. Right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Thank you for watching avidly at home or in the office or wherever you might be. And with that, safe journey.